Hello and welcome back to part 3 of a series that I'm calling What is a... in this case, Druid, exactly, where I aim to explore what each of the player classes are like in D&D, what it's like to be them, what inspired them, some sort of interesting role-playing ideas, and kind of what they mean to me, so that people who are new to playing these classes can have an interesting take or an in-depth idea of what they can expect when they're playing this class, and simultaneously I'll be illustrating a symbol, a logo, an emblem that I think really describes this class so that I can turn it into merch, I can turn it into t-shirts, which I'll be selling on my website. There should be a link down below in the description box if you like the design and you'd like a copy for yourself. And everyone had loads of ideas in the last video of what class I should cover next. There were so many conflicting opinions that I asked my patrons what they would prefer, and in a poll they selected the Druid. A class that I was relatively unfamiliar with until I started making this video, but now I absolutely love them and I can't wait to play one next. So I hope this will instill the same feeling in you as we begin to talk about Druids. So throughout this video you're actually going to see 2 different designs that I came up with for the Druid, because I have quite a lot to say about Druids. And usually, I tend not to actually design more than one thing for this. I just tend to go with whatever my first thought is, and it works out pretty nicely, I think. But for this one, the first design I came up with was really aggressive. It was very, it seemed more kind of combat focused. It seemed more kind of, maybe more ranger adjacent. I didn't actually get the kind of vibe of a Druid from it, but I went all the way through this process. I sort of liked it. It was okay. And then I uploaded it to the website as a t-shirt that people could purchase. Left it there for a couple of days, and in the end I just didn't quite like it. The end result actually didn't fit the size of a t-shirt very well, so the emblem itself was quite small because it didn't fit the dimensions. So in the end I changed the canvas size that I was working on and went for a totally different design that I feel suits the Druid more. But seeing as I've got so much to say, I thought I would show you both designs getting worked on, with the one that I ended up scrapping first. So hopefully that's not too weird to watch while I go through this process. But anyway, designs aside, what is a Druid exactly? Well, Druids are real-life people who exist even into this current day, pretty much. They're rare, but they still exist. They're a spiritual and natural Celtic pagan set of worshippers who are a far cry from their D&D counterparts, but I also doubt that they turn down the opportunity to transform into a direwolf at will, as this character class allows you to do, because honestly, who wouldn't want that power? Originally, the Druids were high-ranking scholars, lawkeepers, medical practitioners, advisors, and peacekeepers in ancient Celtic society, with the name stemming from a cluster of similar roots like Druid, meaning sorcerer in Old Irish, or Driaw, meaning seer in Middle Welsh, and so on and so forth, with the origin in Proto-Celtic, meaning something in the neighbourhood of Oak Knower in the literal translation, which meant something along the lines of a knowledgeable person, someone who was well acquainted with nature, I suppose. While Druids are one of the base classes that players can choose from in 5th edition D&D, they're a more recent addition to the game than the Big 3 classes that players could embody when Dungeons & Dragons was first released. Initially, players could pick from a wizard, a fighter, and a cleric in terms of classes, but it wasn't until 1976's release of the Eldritch Wizardry supplement for 1st edition that people had the opportunity to pick the psionic or the Druid options at character creation. Even then, in later editions, they were considered a subclass of clerics rather than a class of their own, with their magical abilities being considered divine in origin, just as a cleric or a paladin's are. Arguably, the powers of a druid fall somewhere in between divine magic, like those belonging to paladins and clerics, and arcane magic, which are those spells cast by wizards, sorcerers, and the like. Usually we categorize their power as ancient or primal magic, distinguishing it from either form of spellcaster, and that's kind of a general theme that you'll see throughout the Druid. They are utterly their own class with elements of others, untethered from the confines of more clearly defined classes like the fighter or the wizard. They have their own magic, which is used largely by themselves and occasionally by rangers, and they don't fit neatly into a single category like most classes tend to. We tend to pin labels on most classes, with heavily armoured fighters or paladins being considered tanks, classes who, among other things, are really good at soaking up damage and surviving attacks. Wizards, warlocks, spellcasters of all kinds, rangers and rogues are largely seen as damage dealers, characters who are likely to be less survivable and may die more easily if they provoke attacks, but are usually really good at dispatching enemies either before they can be reached by using some sort of ranged attack, or by destroying enemies really quickly, so quickly in fact, that they don't get the opportunity to attack in response. And finally, clerics, bards, and so on are more often than not seen as healer characters, or support characters in some capacity, who can do a plethora of interesting things, but they also have an unmatched affinity for keeping their allies alive, enchanting their friends to improve their attributes, and cursing their foes with numerous afflictions, which make them easier to slay. But druids are pretty much a jack of all trades, capable of fulfilling all of these roles really well, while bringing some of the most unique skills and abilities to the game also. In short, the TLDR of what a druid is a nature-based spellcaster who can wear some kinds of armour, so they're pretty durable, and who deal in old, creepy, wild and long-forgotten power to harness and live in harmony with the natural forces that other classes tend to be unable to commune with. Being a jack of all trades means that they don't typically gain proficiency with heavy armour, depending on your background and player species, but they do get to use medium armour, which is far more than most spellcasters. They gain access to a lot of spells, most of which are unique to them, or are available to themselves and rangers, but they can cast far fewer spells than wizards or sorcerers, for example, and they have actually pretty devastating combat skills, although less than maybe a fighter or a ranger, for example. Druids either revere and worship nature in a sort of servile capacity, have more of a commanding relationship with nature, which they use to harness and manipulate its power, or have a more personal connection, more like a monk, I guess, realizing that all things are inherently connected and that they can simply reach through the world calling upon the planet and the natural forces around them for aid, and having that call tangibly be answered when they cast their spells. This takes the form of abilities that we might expect, like forming great vines to lash at their foes, communicating with animals and plants, locating plants and animals, detecting poisons, and so on, but it also means that they can tap into the very fundamental forces of reality itself, allowing them to harness life force to heal, as well as any cleric, conjure the elemental building blocks of matter to tap into the elemental planes, and form flaming blades, control water, summon walls of stone, reverse and even control gravity, demolish civilizations with tsunamis, and even reincarnate and resurrect dead allies and other creatures. Druids also get to use a wide variety of tools and weapons, which most spellcasters tend not to. Things like clubs and maces, scimitars, shields, but also, most iconic of all, sickles, which have become almost the unofficial logo of the druid because of references to harvesting naturally grown things, but also because it's only really a druid who gains this specific weapon proficiency in its character creation. The one weird caveat to all their armour and weapon proficiencies is that they will not wear armour or shields made of metal. Some DMs also like to rule that they don't use weapons made of metal also, but that's not an official rule as written. The aim of this specific requirement is to force druids to look and act differently for how we might expect a cleric to appear, for example, to separate them and distinguish them. They're designed to be dressed in animal skins, for example, and pieces of bark so that they seem more wild and connected to nature than their more traditionally armoured kin. But this is by no means a limitation. D&D takes place in a fantastical world, where wooden weapons need not be any less dull or strong than those made from metal. Perhaps ironbark is cultivated by the wood elves of your campaign world, as it is mine, or obsidian shards may be flaked and smashed to make the fine razors that adorn a mahuitl. A mahuitl, the ancient Mesoamerican blade whose brittle edges were said to be vastly sharper than any smithed sword. Maybe a high elf druid wears armour of pure crystal or flexible glass that bends as they do. A dwarf may have plates of stone covering their body, a Triton may be dressed in exotic and sturdy coral, still living despite being removed from their subterranean environment. And the more edgy and vengeful Druid, seeking to restore balance in nature's favour, may wear armour of animal bones or dragon hide to represent those creatures whose habitats have been razed by civilization's unending hunger for resources, so that they can act as a horrifying revenant of nature itself. To be honest though, this is mostly an opportunity to allow for greater characterization, and metals are definitely of the earth, and well within a druid's command, so there's no reason why they wouldn't be able to wear metal armor, but traditionally worked metal seems weirdly less cool by comparison than some of these other options. Where a druid really shines, and what distinguishes a druid from the other classes, is that in addition to having a smorgasbord of powers and skills that are familiar to other classes, with perhaps a more natural twist, they can also transform into animals in an ability called Wild Shape, which is incredibly cool and potentially super broken if you put it in the wrong hands. Now that I know that all the metagamers have started really listening, their ears are pricked right up, we can carry on. So druids have this feature that lets them physically become certain types of animals that they're familiar with a number of times per day. Some subclasses let the druid do this more often, but to start off with, it's twice per day. As the druid becomes stronger, the types of animals that they can become improve, eventually being able to become any creature of a challenge rating 1 or below, which is an absolute ton by the way. At high enough levels, they can even fly, turning into things like eagles and so on. As of some of the recent updates to these rules, druids who want to focus more on being spellcasters rather than transforming into animals can instead use this feature to summon wild creatures as familiars instead. The only specifications of what you can transform into are that they have to be an appropriate challenge rating for your level, which the player's handbook describes, and you can't use any of the weird magical features that the creature might have. So if you turn into something like a dragon somehow, let's say for example, you'd be able to use its sort of claws and its bite, and potentially based on what level you are, you might be able to fly and so on, but you wouldn't be able to turn into a dragon that would be able to use a dragon's breath, for example, because that's a magical feature. And depending on what subclass you pick, you probably won't be able to cast spells while in animal form, with a few exceptions, but spells and features that you activate beforehand can still be maintained. The classic example being someone who multiclasses between a barbarian and a druid can enter a rage, then transform into an animal and be an animal in that rage state. But we're getting off topic a little bit. The most difficult challenge is that you need to convince your DM that your character could have met and is familiar with this type of creature that you want to turn into. And the biggest example of this is in the case of dinosaurs. All DMs like to put dinosaurs in their games. We have stats for them, they're amazing, we've been fascinated with them since childhood, we write them into our lore, we want to throw a T-Rex at you really badly, so you're gonna meet some dinosaurs if you go to the right environment. But if you're Nigel, the wizard's apprentice from the super industrial city, and suddenly, in a very narrative-driven campaign, you poof into a velociraptor at the first sign of danger, your DM is going to ask how on earth Nigel has ever met one of these. Or is this meta-knowledge, and did the player just realise that they're the single most deadly, challenge rating 1/4 creature that druids can easily transform into? To which you need to be able to convincingly say that Nigel's dad, Brian, was actually a velociraptor tamer. He lost an eye and an arm to a velociraptor attack, so that's why he and his family moved to the big city, away from all the velociraptors, to which your DM will begrudgingly say, okay. It's important as well for this animal transformation effect to be something that you consider when you're creating your character, because, to be fair, if you're in a stealth mission or something like that, and you want to transform into a crow, no one's going to suspect a crow, that's totally fine. But it's a tiny bit on the dull side of things. One thing that I love players to do is to tell me how their creatures resemble themselves. What elements of the character that they've created remain in this beast form. When you transform into a beast, you can choose for all of your armor, all of your gear, everything you're carrying to meld into you in this magical process. So you may not get to wear your clothes, but you can still describe how your character is expressed through their animal forms. in World of Warcraft, which takes a lot of inspiration from D&D, when the Night Elves transform into their Druid cat form, these large panther-like beasts. Their feline form still has these really long ears to emulate the fact that they are elven in some capacity. Sometimes they still have pieces of cloth wrapped around their paws and their necks that resemble elven silks. They have moon-like sigils emblazoned in their fur, and their skin takes on this rich blue hue as it would have in their elven form. The Tauren, the Minotaur-like beasts that you get to play in World of Warcraft, can also be druids, and when they transform into a similar creature, the horns from their bull-like form is still visible on these animals. They have kind of brown, patchy, traditional sort of cow-like colours to the animals that they transform into. I had a druid in one of my campaigns fairly recently who was a tiny little possum who was very timid and surprised the entire party by transforming into a direwolf at one point, and we had great fun describing how little Marmalade the possum transforms into this huge beast and how her grey fur, some of the striped markings, her pale face and her pink nose, her pink paws and so on, still translate into this giant direwolf form, so that we still know that it's her if she was in a crowd of other direwolves. But you don't necessarily have to do that if stealth is the aim of the game, but I think it's a missed opportunity if you don't describe a bit of your character when you transform into an animal. But as well as getting all of the very, very fun stats that this beast that you transform into, this beast that's in the monster manual, has access to, as long as you can realistically have met these, the main reason why this ability will make your DM cry is because of how it can be pushed and how you can be shoved out of your animal form. You can transform back into your humanoid form as a bonus action, because you may want to speak or cast spells, or the town guard may get very suspicious if the large angry lizard chicken that is a velociraptor that looks like it can disembowel people is wandering around while they're on duty. But aside from those decisions, the only way to be forced out of your beast form is for your animal form to reach 0 HP. So the druids don't turn into anything eye-wateringly powerful, the decision was made to make wild shape only allow druids to turn into beasts fairly low challenge ratings. And that means in combat they have really low health pools. To counteract this, Wizards of the Coast decided that when you reach 0 HP in your beast form, you just poof back into your humanoid form, having taken no physical damage yourself. And this means that you could, if you wanted to be utterly indestructible, transform into something with a beefy amount of HP, like a brown bear, maul a bunch of goblins until you're knocked out of that form, and then use your second use of this ability to transform back into a bear who has full health again, and keep going on like that, utterly trivializing combat until you are reduced to having to use some of your amazing and terrifying natural magic. Oh dear. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Getting to talk about the Druid was an absolute ton of fun, and I hope you enjoyed the design that I came up with here. I decided to put an owl front and center in the middle of this design, kind of going back to the roots of what a druid is, this kind of wise scholar of nature. Owls are always associated with being wise, but there's behind the kind of cuteness, behind the sweetness and intelligence of an owl is also the fact that they are ruthless predators, which definitely embodies a druid to me. Preserving the balance, looking after nature, but not being afraid to eviscerate people who stand in the way of the natural order. I chose to use a lot of oak leaves in the design here. When I was growing up, there were lots of oak trees all over the place, and that's kind of what I associate with nature. It reminded me a little bit of the Green Man as well, for example, a typical motif in, I suppose, pagan, more pantheistic, I guess, artwork in the UK. There's no real actual lore about the Green Man, but it's just sort of like a connection to nature. It's always a face made up of oak leaves and things like that I really like the idea of. So I decided to put that kind of motif behind this owl face. There's the cycles of the moon to kind of return to this theme of harmony, balance, and also this kind of natural illumination that we feel somewhat unsafe at night, but the druid would be right at home because they know nature. They are a friend of it and a conduit of it. I decided to put the large antlers in here, mostly to tie it back into my previous design, but also to show the kind of magicalness, the spiritualness, and the strangeness of the druid. That an owl would be almost too natural, and that an owl with these large antlers is in some way magical, spiritual, and perhaps connected to the Fae. Again, this sort of docile deer that that can definitely defend itself if needed. And I put the emblems of the Druid, the sickle, in here as well, to represent the humanoid side of things, harvest, and well, just because they look cool. If you like this design, it will be up right now on my website and on my merch page. And T-Mill, the company who makes these very, very wonderful products for me, are actually having a free shipping weekend right now, which is why I've chosen to publish today's video today, so that you guys can get a good saving on this design. T-Mill are a fantastic company that I think even Druid players would be happy to work alongside and purchase from. Everyone in the process of making these products are paid a fair and living wage. They use solar energy and other forms of renewable energy for the entire process. And I've talked a lot in my other videos about the benefits of all the environmentally conscious decisions that go into what they have decided to make here and why I've chosen them. But I'll make sure to leave a link down below as well to where you can hear more, you can read more about their environmentally friendly practices and why I've decided to go with these guys. But anyway, like I say, thank you so much for joining me. Make sure to leave in the comment section what class you'd like me to cover next. I'll look forward to seeing you on Monday for my next Monster Monday video. So until next time, happy monster hunting, enjoy your wild shaping, and I'll see you later.